Hello students. Today's class is about gender, class and ethnicity. You must already know about two documentary filmmaking practices, direct cinema and cinema verite. Direct cinema that emerges from the ethics of journalistic practices, a fly-on-the-wall kind of a practice where there is minimum or almost no intervention on behalf of the filmmaker and the crew, which tries to see the reality as it is and tries to see the truth as objectively as possible. The another counterpart, that is direct cinema, cinema's European counterpart was cinema verite. Both these movements started almost similarly around 1960s. Cinema verite emerged out of where direct cinema was a part, came out of journalistic ethics, more objective truth claim, etc. Cinema verite, on the other hand, began from the discipline of anthropology, ethnography, etc. And when it comes to both of these movements' claim to truth, cinema verite, on the other hand, tried to go for probing into the truth to gain the ultimate truth. Let me explain and try to understand whether these two movements sound similar or contradictory. I'll repeat again. When we talk about direct cinema, we talk about a journalistic ethics, we talk about objective truth call, and we mean a fly-on-the-wall approach. When it comes to cinema verite, we mean a kind of documentary filmmaking where a minimum intervention, some sort of intervention of the filmmaker is there to probe the truth, to gain a greater and deeper knowledge of the truth. Two most important figures of cinema verite is Jean Rouch and Edgar Morin. Both of these filmmakers were academicians primarily. Jean Rouch was an anthropologist himself, and Edgar Morin was a sociologist, a French sociologist and philosopher. They were inspired by Dziga Vertov's Kino Pravda movement, where, Dziga Vertov had this idea that, small reels of documentary films, when put together, will give a better and a deeper understanding of the truth. So, almost similar, these two movements, you might find in many books and internet references that these two movements are considered as similar. However, there is a minute difference. For cinema verite, the filmmakers choose to intervene instead of remaining a fly on the wall because there are some ethical questions associated with anthropology, ethnography, etc. What do I mean by that? I mean that in the classes, seminars, etc. of this discipline, these documentary films were used as materials. By materials, I mean as supporting materials, accessory to their knowledge, accessory to their discourses, and most importantly, using these documentary films as proofs and evidences. Interestingly, Jean Rouch was very much aware of the problems of institutionally producing a knowledge, institutionally producing a documentary film, what problems could be there. Institutionally produced knowledge is always has a claim to objectivity, claim to a kind of a distant idea of a knowledge that the researcher should have a distance from the object of research and will capture the reality as it is. Jean Rouch knew that this method, when applied in a filmmaking process that happens on the people of a particular community, a community that is marginal, a community that has a particular ethnicity, a group of people in terms of sex, gender, class, caste, different identities, these kind of generating objective truth and knowledge has its own problem. This kind of looking through the camera could sometimes be colonial in nature, could misrepresent them, could appropriate them into the mainstream narratives, etc. Which is why the difference that I just now talked about of direct cinema and cinema verite lies there, that while unraveling the truth, direct cinema tried to remain a fly on the wall. With Jean Rouch and Edgar Morin, cinema verite tried to probe in. because they believe that without a little bit of involvement, as a researcher, the filmmaker should be involved with the process and should not be an outside agent who's as if looking into a community like a colonizer or like a superior being or like somebody is in power. There is a word in social sciences, in humanities, in philosophy. Many of us may be aware of it. Many of us may be hearing it from the first time. Is the word called other. Other, O-T-H-E-R, the simple word other. Other is something that the society constantly creates to maintain a division, to maintain a kind of a difference between people. On the basis of this othering, there are certain group of people who are always privileged and there are some people who are always marginalized. How does this othering happen? Othering happen through one very basic idea that is called binary. Binary means what one is and what one is not. In social sciences, in humanities, we understand binary in terms of this, that a binary is something that is what a self is not. In the sense, an other and the self is in binary. That means an other is somebody what the self is not. That is how, through this binary, a constant othering happens. Yes, we use the word othering. It's a process. It constant happen. We create an other out of a woman. How do we do it? A woman is a person who's not a man, binary. We create othering in terms of class. How we do it? A working class is somebody who is not a person who has access to the means of production. Othering happens also in terms of ethnicity. For example, in Indian context, the Adivasis, the Aboriginals, the Red Indians, Australia, America, the different geographical location. We have indigenous people who has greater claim to their land. But whenever we talk about it, an othering happens. How do we do that? We make them an other as if we consider ourselves the mainstream, the people who has been modern, who has a certain access to modernity, considered that civilization to be uncivilized, savage, etc. And I am not that. That is how othering happens, and through that othering, a constant majority and minority, etc., groups, etc., gets created. Jean Rouch was very, very aware of this fact, that how this kind of othering may also impact this kind of filmmaking. By this kind of, I mean ethnographic anthropologist filmmaking and anthropological filmmaking, the documentary filmmakings. That if I, as a filmmaker, as a researcher, go to capture the truth of a given community, who am I? And who are those people whom I am actually capturing, whom I am actually shooting? Am I taking a part in that othering process? Am I othering those people? And am I the empowered one with an apparatus, with a camera, shooting and trying to capture their reality and appropriate it in terms of my need and knowledge production? He knew that if only we can think beyond the institutional idea of knowledge and knowledge production, then only can we go and reach the deeper truth, the reality in some manner. Jean Rouch has in mind the existing, because he is working during the 60s, he has in mind the existing anthropological documentary filmmaking that used to happen, that used to be presented, and etc. He was also aware that if you are not careful, if you are apparently trying to be objective and see and look into this community from an outsider's perspective, these images or the images that will be produced out of these communities or that would be produced, while capturing their lives and living condition, could end up becoming exotic, could end up becoming, oriental, sometimes also end up portraying a very cruel and comic portrayal of that community. He knew that without an access to the culture, without living the culture, by living I mean, living with the people, gaining their trust, gaining their faith, so that they can also participate in this process. If they are outside of this process, and I, as an outsider, as a researcher, I go and capture those moments, I perhaps will not have a perfect image or a perfect narrative or a perfect portrayal of the community that I'm trying to portray. So at this moment, I will give you a reference to a particular essay called The Reproduction of Cinematic Reality. This essay is by Meek Eaton. That essay actually is trying to talk about Jean Rouch's films, and he is not only talking about Jean Rouch's films, he's also borrowing Jean Rouch's idea, the writings, essays, and everything that Jean Rouch wrote, and he's trying to see what does he mean by this kind of an ethical practice. And we, from this, will try to figure out whether it is possible to apply that in understanding different other minority groups as well, be it gender, be it caste, be it ethnicity, be it class, anything. We have to also understand that when Jean Rouch was working, it was 1960s, and our contemporary is a bit different. And when we have to, or we get involved into this kind of a filmmaking, the question of ethics and etc. has also developed a lot. Researchers nowadays, as a part of their curriculum, learn the question of ethics. It's not that people never used to learn that around 1960s or something, but we all know that justice and ethics, all these things are also dependent on the time. Sometimes certain things, it takes time and ages, to acknowledge the problems or inherent problem in certain articulations, inherent problems in certain ways of looking, etc., etc. So we will also try to borrow from Jean Rouch, and we try to, in future, when you would also make films, you will try to perhaps apply these, but not necessarily, make it a copybook thing, because your reality would be different. The way, in 50s or 60s, when Jean Rouch was traveling to Africa, the way he was approaching or the way he had access to the communities, your ways of accessing to the communities would be different when you are trying to make film on any ethnic group or any gender group or any marginal communities. Why? Because one, social media and everything, your method of sampling, your method of having access to the community and everything would be different. Two, this is a time where we cannot expect that the people of the community will remain unaware of the world. It's a post-globalized world. A world where different part of the globe has been connected through internet, has been connected through different communicative medias, etc. They will also be aware. So it is up to us to consider what we should do for our films, the films that we are making now, and how can we also borrow the ethical questions from some of the filmmakers we may consider as, great filmmakers, the film that they made were classics and etc. So Meek Eaton, in his essay, Reproduction of Cinematic Reality, talks about talks about Jean Rouch's idea on this kind of filmmaking. First and foremost, he quotes Jean Rouch saying that Jean Rouch always maintained and believed that aesthetic reality or aesthetic beauty has nothing to do with these films. More you pay attention to the aesthetic beauty, try to make these images and everything beautiful, this will be funny because it will only end up creating a very surface level untruth kind of a reality. What he believed was in a very raw and truthful image for that matter. So the next thing, I'll give you 3 points here. So Meek Eaton points out that when a question was asked to Jean Rouch that for whom do you make these films, he gave us 3 points. 1, he says, I make the film for myself. What does he mean by that? So unlike a direct cinema kind of a director who would claim that I have nothing to do with the film, Jean Rouch actually says, I make the film for myself. What does he mean by that? He means that he wants to be the guarantor of the film. That I have made this film, and if it is a flawed and a false and a misrepresentation, I am accountable, you hold me accountable. So I am involved in the process. The next point he gives is that, first, it is for me. 2, it is for the people who has taken part in the pro-filmic event. That is the people who have participated in the films. If I don't involve them, then what is the purpose of making the film? Take the film to the seminar hall and show it to others? No. So the people who have participated is my primary focus. So they should be able to see the films. He also gives an interesting example. He says that how beautiful it is if you show the film to these people, because he also made a film on hippopotamus hunters. And when he showed the films to the hunters later on, he used some kind of a background music and everything. The people of those community told him that you cannot use music, in this kind of a film. He said, why? They said that hippopotamus hunting is a very silent business. So if you want the truth, you cannot use the music.
Sur la plage a lieu le combat final.
And he points out that this is why it is so important to involve the people who are participating in the pro-filmic event, because they will give you the real idea of how the picture has happened. And most importantly, he says that unlike a colonizer, I should have to show it to them so that they don't believe or they don't have an idea that I shot them and then made a film like a Tarzan. I don't want to do that. And the third point that he says that, and finally, I make the film for everybody. Depending on class, caste, gender, ethnicity, and because of this constant othering, we have bizarre and distorted idea about these groups, how they function, how they live, and everything. Which is why he says that it is important that everybody sees this film and these films and realize that, for example, a particular ethnic group, they are not savages. To understand that people or a community of a particular gender, they have certain sufferings. And a particular class, they have their own suffering, problems, oppressions, and etc. And it is as nuanced, as complex as everybody's life, everybody's reality. Now, these three things are very important, I believe, that ethical, these are more or less ethical questions that Jean Rouch help us identify, that for whom are we making the film? Can we remember this, that for whom we are making this film? I'll give you some final points to the methods he employs to kind of make the film that he says he wants to make, one for himself, again for the people who are participating, and finally for everybody. He believes that ethnographic film should have very less commercial value. Not much money should be involved in it. He also believes that the filmmaker should be the first editor. By that, he means that you should not carry a lot of crew and people into the process so that the community you are trying to work on, they become startled. I mean, they are confused, that as if it's a huge production going on. They would not be able to kind of, participate in the process, which is why it has to be a 1-person, 2-person, or maximum 3-person job. Interestingly, he prescribes that zoom lens should be avoided. The camera should be at the level. Seeing something from top is a big no-no. It's blasphemy almost. Because the camera has to be on their level. Camera cannot take a position higher than the people they are trying to communicate or trying to, capture. He also says that portable sound is very important for him, because he also used a portable sound device and where he can remain with the camera far away from the character, and the character can talk and keep on talking without any intervention. And he says, instead of a commentary, can we think about titles and subtitles, etc., so that there is no voice of God kind of a commentary? Even if you need to have a commentary, what you can do is, like Jean Rouch does himself, you can narrate the thing yourself as a filmmaker. Jean Rouch used to be the commentator of used to give voiceover of his films. Interestingly, he also used to give voiceover of the English translation. He was a French person. And he would speak in a broken, grammatically wrong English, just to mark the presence that even the filmmaker is flawed.
Le 28 avril, les pêcheurs infatigables le rattrapent à Thibaut. Les préparatifs de combat sont pris.
Now, I will end with a very quick example from one of Jean Rouch's films, that is A Chronicle of a Summer. In one of the section, we find that he is, holding an interview with a group of people that he would be following the film. There is a woman who asks the other participants that, can you tell me what's written on my hand? There was a tattoo on her hand. Nobody could figure out. We know from her that that is a tattoo that she got when she was in Auschwitz in a concentration camp. She was a Jew. And she explains what the number means, etc., etc.
On va te poser une question à Landry. Landry, est-ce que tu as remarqué que Marceline avait sur son bras un numéro?
Oui.
Qu'est-ce que c'est, tu crois?
Non, j'ai aucune idée.
Aucune idée. Bon. Et toi, Raymond?
Moi, je ne sais pas exactement. Je sais que ce sont les marins qui portent d'habitude des numéros sur les bras. Et comme elle n'est pas de la marine...
Alors, pourquoi?
Je ne sais pas exactement ce que ça veut dire, oui.
C'est la coquetterie.
Peut-être, oui. Je vois arriver.
Pourquoi un chiffre?
J'aurais pu mettre un cœur. J'aurais pu mettre un cœur.
Non, ça ne peut pas être le numéro de téléphone parce que c'est trop long, 78 750.
Mais tout d'abord, ce n'est pas un V, c'est un triangle qui est la moitié de l'étoile juive. Je ne sais pas si tu connais le symbole juif, qui est l'étoile à 6 branches. Et d'autre part, le numéro, ce n'est pas mon numéro de téléphone.
From an interview of Jean Rouch, later on, we get to know that right after the scene, there is a scene, it's there in the film, that you will find that the woman is walking on the street of Paris. And she was supposed to talk about her father and the concentration camp. Jean Rouch said that they knew that at that moment a shooting was going on Paris about Second World War. And they thought that if they can take the woman at that place and those, elements and shooting of Second World War might trigger some memory and she may be able to talk about her father. Turns out the shooting was not happening on that day. So what they did was they left the sound audio recording device with her and they just told her that, can you just keep on remembering your father? And they were observing her from a distance. Turns out, while she is walking and walking and walking, she's trying to remember her father. Then suddenly she sees these huge arcades in the street of Paris, and those arcades and everything reminds her of her father. The space, the city itself reminds her of her father. And she suddenly goes into epiphany, talks about her father, cries out loud, etc., etc.
Quand je t'ai vu, tu m'as dit, et maman, et Michel. Tu m'as appelée ta petite fille. J'étais presque heureuse d'être déportée avec toi, tellement je t'aimais. Papa. Papa. Comme je voudrais t'avoir maintenant. Puis...
Jean Rouch talks about that kind of a film. That where there will be a probing. They tried to probe, isn't it? They tried to place the character in a context in the shooting set which might help. But at the same time, you will also have to keep a distance. You have to involve them in the process. Then only you get a final outcome. With one last thing I would like to end is that this reminds me of one important aspect of humanities, social sciences, gender studies is reading oral history. Oral history is a form of a history that we take from people's narrative, from memory and etc. People tries to remember. You go and talk to a person, talk to your grandfather and ask them about, for example, India's struggle for freedom. They'll give you narratives and etc. But researchers who work in oral history always knows that when you left the truth to be told by these people, many times they'd exaggerate. Same with Cinema Verite. When Jean Rouch knew that ethnic identity, marginal identity, when they perform in front of camera, they tend to perform, they tend to exaggerate. But Jean Rouch knew that we should not probe and force them to say the truth. Instead, believe that truth itself, because that is the truth, that is the reality at that moment for that community that the filmmaker is trying to, will have to be happy and content about. So with this, I'll end today's lecture. Thank you.